the Ethiopian church took all of this literature, which included literature that nobody considered scripture at the time, and they appear to have just been non-discretionary and included everything.
The final words of an Ethiopian monk about Jesus Christ are raising questions the modern world was never supposed to hear. For 60 years, he lived inside a cliff-top monastery in northern Ethiopia, isolated behind a single leather rope, guarding a manuscript older than most surviving copies of the New Testament itself. Written in Ge'ez, the sacred language of Ethiopian Christianity, the book was never shown to outsiders. He never preached from it, never quoted it, never allowed it to leave the room. But on the final night of his life, as candles flickered against the stone walls of the monastery and his disciples gathered around his bed, the old monk finally broke his silence. What he revealed were 3 teachings attributed to Christ that some believe institutional Christianity spent nearly 2,000 years trying to erase. So before we uncover what was hidden inside this forbidden manuscript, make sure to subscribe, because the deeper this mystery goes, the more impossible it becomes to ignore. Brother Johannes, only 26 years old, stood beside him holding a brass basin, watching the old man's trembling hands with fear he had never felt before. Across the room, Deacon Michael refused to even look directly at the manuscript resting on the goatskin coverlet. The pages were ancient vellum. The script was Ge'ez, the language Ethiopian tradition says was spoken by angels themselves, and the manuscript they guarded was unlike any Bible most of the world has ever seen. Because while the Western Bible was sealed at 66 books, the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition preserved 81. Among them was the Book of Enoch, a forbidden text describing the Watchers, fallen angels who descended upon Mount Hermon and changed human history forever. But tonight's secret was even bigger than Enoch. According to the dying monk, the missing teachings of Christ were never truly lost. They were hidden. And before we uncover what was written inside this forbidden manuscript, make sure to subscribe and join us, because the deeper this mystery goes, the more impossible it becomes to ignore. Rome removed it. Ethiopia preserved it. But the Book of Enoch is not the reason Abba Tekle lies trembling on his deathbed tonight. The real secret is something far more unsettling. Resting on the goatskin cloth before him is a text known as the Mashafa Kedas, the Book of the Covenant. For 6 decades, Abba Tekle guarded this manuscript in silence because he believed it contained the missing piece of Christianity itself, a section of Christ's teachings that history nearly erased completely. Think about what the Western Gospels actually reveal. Between the resurrection and the ascension, there are 40 days, arguably the most critical period in the entire Christian faith. Yet, in the Gospel of Luke, those 40 days are summarized in only a few brief lines. Jesus appears, he speaks, he blesses the disciples, then he ascends. 40 days reduced to almost nothing. An empty space in history. But according to the Mashafa Kedas, that silence was never empty. The text claims that when Christ returned after the crucifixion, he did not come back to comfort his followers. He returned with urgency, like a commander delivering final instructions moments before disaster strikes. His first warning was direct and unforgettable. Do not build temples from stone, because stone will eventually fall. Build the temple within the heart, because that alone endures. This was not symbolic poetry. It was a warning aimed directly at the systems that would later rise in his name. The manuscript describes Christ foretelling religious leaders who would use sacred authority to gather wealth and power. It speaks of empires carrying the cross as a banner while using fear, violence, and control to dominate entire populations. Crusades, inquisitions, towers built with the suffering of the poor beneath them. According to the text, true believers were never meant to belong to the machinery of power. Brother Johannes feels the weight of those words immediately. And if this sounds unsettling now, imagine how Abba Tekle felt reading it for the first time at 31 years old. And subscribe before we continue, because the next teaching is the one the monks believed was too dangerous for the outside world to hear. They feared that if these words had spread through the Roman Empire, the entire structure of institutional religion could have collapsed overnight. The room grows quiet. The candlelight flickers across the monastery walls. Deacon Michael leans closer as Abba Tekle struggles to breathe. Then he begins speaking again. This next teaching sounds less like theology and more like a diagnosis of the human soul. He explains that every person carries two invisible forces within them, the wind of life and the wind of error. But the wind of error is not described as ordinary sin. It behaves like an infection. It enters through greed, through corrupt desires, through lies spoken aloud. And once it settles inside a person, it slowly hardens them from within. The manuscript calls these people walking tombs, people who continue living outwardly, eating, working, sleeping, repeating routines, while internally something sacred has already died. That image remained hidden inside these mountains for nearly 2,000 years. But after revealing the sickness, the text also reveals the cure. And the cure is not ritual, not ceremony, not even religious institutions. It is knowledge, direct personal awareness of truth without intermediaries standing between humanity and the divine. Christ teaches his followers to watch their own minds carefully, like guards protecting the gates of a city, aware of every thought entering and leaving. Then comes the line the monks considered revolutionary. The kingdom of heaven exists within you, hidden in the silence between thoughts. If ordinary people in the Roman world had truly accepted that idea, everything would have changed. Fear-based, religious control would have weakened. Temple systems would have lost their authority. Entire empires built on spiritual dependence could have collapsed. People connected directly to the divine are extremely difficult to control. According to Abba Tekle, that is why the Mashafa Kidon disappeared from history. But even this was not the manuscript's most dangerous teaching. Brother Johannes offers the old monk water. He refuses. His breathing is growing weaker now. The candle is almost gone. Then he reveals the final warning the monks protected for centuries. In the text, the risen Christ tells his disciples something deeply disturbing. The darkness will come wearing my face, not as an obvious enemy, not as a visible tyrant, but as a deception disguised perfectly as holiness itself. It would speak in his name, carry his symbols, build monuments in his honor, and quote his teachings while quietly destroying everything he originally stood for. According to this manuscript, the Antichrist was never described as a single future ruler. It was a system, an institution hiding behind the image of Christ while betraying his message completely. And the monks of Debre Damo believed those words were not predicting the future at all. They believed the warning described a reality already unfolding. Abba Tekle spent his entire life reading those passages in silence. But on this final night, he believed the world had finally reached the moment they were written for. There was, however, one Western scholar who came dangerously close to uncovering these secrets. His name was Jacques Mercier, a French ethnologist connected to the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique in Paris. During the late 1990s, Ethiopian authorities trusted him to study and authenticate the Garima Gospels, ancient illustrated manuscripts, later dated between 330 and 650 AD, making them some of the oldest surviving illustrated Christian texts on earth. While much of Europe descended into chaos during the Dark Ages, Ethiopia's remote monasteries remained isolated within mountain fortresses, quietly preserving ancient traditions and manuscripts that much of the outside world had already forgotten. Untouched, unedited, never approved by Rome. Jacques Mercier understood that feeling the moment he first handled the Garima Gospels. The French ethnologist, known for his work with Ethiopia's ancient Christian manuscripts, later described the experience in unforgettable terms. He spoke about the silence in the room, the weight of the pages in his hands, even the trembling in his fingers, as he realized the texts before him were older than nearly every authority he had ever been taught to trust. Only fragments of the Mashafa Kedan have ever been examined by Western scholars, but several of those who encountered it privately described something strangely similar to Mercier's reaction, a dizzying sensation that the foundation of everything they believed was suddenly shifting beneath them. Abba Tekla had lived with that feeling since 1965. For 60 years, he carried it in silence. And what he is preparing to reveal to Brother Johannes and Deacon Michael tonight is still not the most dangerous secret hidden inside these mountains, because the most dangerous thing may not be the manuscript at all. It may be what rests beneath the stone beneath their feet. For nearly 3,000 years, Ethiopia has made a claim the rest of the world never stopped questioning, that the Ark of the Covenant is not lost. According to Ethiopian tradition, it is still here, protected inside the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in the ancient city of Aksum. Not symbolic, not metaphorical. Physically there, the story appears in the Kebra Nagast, Ethiopia's sacred royal chronicle. It tells how the Queen of Sheba traveled to Jerusalem and met King Solomon. From that union came a son, Menelik I. Years later, Menelik returned to visit his father in Jerusalem. Solomon offered him the throne of Israel, but Menelik refused and instead journeyed back to Ethiopia. According to the tradition, he did not return alone. He and his companions secretly removed the Ark of the Covenant from the Holy of Holies, replacing it with a replica before carrying the original Ark into Africa. Now consider how the Bible itself describes the Ark. Armies destroyed instantly, men collapsing dead after touching it without permission, fire and energy with no obvious explanation. And when modern researchers read those descriptions not as symbolic mythology, but as technical observations, the symptoms sound disturbingly familiar, almost like exposure to a powerful radioactive source. Then there is the detail that makes the story even harder to dismiss. Only one guardian is ever allowed near the Ark at a time. He is chosen for the role, enters the chapel, and never leaves again for the rest of his life. Witnesses who observed these guardians across different generations consistently reported the same physical decline: failing eyesight, premature cataracts, pale skin, weakening bodies, deaths arriving far too early. Those are not normal effects of a secluded spiritual life. They resemble prolonged exposure to something emitting energy. If the Ark were simply an ancient wooden chest covered in gold, none of those patterns should exist, and history suggests powerful groups desperately tried to find it. During the 12th century, the Knights Templar traveled into Ethiopia not merely as pilgrims, but as seekers searching for something specific. Their symbols can still be found carved into the stone churches of Lalibela, but they never took the Ark home. And then there is another mystery. Ethiopia stood almost alone among African nations in resisting colonization. In 1896, When Italy invaded, with modern weapons and the support of a European empire, Ethiopian forces crushed them at the Battle of Adwa. To many inside Ethiopia, that victory was more than military. It was protection. Then there is Lalibela itself, perhaps the most impossible place Abatekla ever witnessed. He visited only once, at the age of 29, yet after 6 decades in isolation, it remained the memory he returned to more than any other. Because Lalibela does not look built, it looks extracted from the earth itself. King Lalibela's 11 churches were not assembled stone by stone like ordinary cathedrals. Entire structures, walls, windows, pillars, chambers, and drainage systems were carved directly downward into solid volcanic rock, not constructed upward, excavated downward. A single mistake during that process would have destroyed entire sections permanently. Every angle, every support system, every hidden chamber had to be perfectly envisioned before the first cut was made. Modern engineers who studied the site reached a disturbing conclusion. Using 12th century tools, the project should have required tens of thousands of workers, laboring continuously for more than a century. Yet historical tradition compresses the construction into roughly 24 years. The timeline simply does not fit. And here is the stranger part. The millions of tons of rock removed during construction are missing. No massive debris fields, no ancient quarry piles, no visible remains of where the stone went. The churches exist. The missing rock does not. The monks preserved an explanation for centuries. They claimed human workers carved during daylight hours, but at night, angels descended to continue the work using tools of light capable of moving through stone without resistance. Whatever that description originally meant, it sounds astonishingly advanced. The most famous structure, the Church of St. George, descends deep into the ground in the shape of a massive cross carved directly into the earth. Beneath the churches stretches a labyrinth of pitch-black tunnels where priesthood candidates once walked alone in complete darkness, guided only by chanting and touch. The architecture itself reflects the teachings of the Mashafa Kadan. To reach the light, you must first pass through darkness. Recent 3D scans revealed sealed chambers hidden beneath parts of the complex, spaces unopened for nearly 800 years. Priests described them as sacred treasuries holding manuscripts, gold, and perhaps even relics connected to the original builders themselves. But no outsider has ever been allowed inside, and according to Abatekla, another secret hidden within Ethiopia may be even more explosive: the bloodline. In mainstream Western Christianity, the story of Jesus ends with resurrection and ascension. Any discussion of descendants or family lineage is generally dismissed entirely. But Ethiopia preserved a very different perspective. The Solomonic dynasty ruled Ethiopia for nearly 3,000 years, from ancient times until 1974. The last emperor, Haile Selassie, carried the title Conquering Lion of the Tribe of Judah, not as symbolism, but as a legal genealogical claim tracing his ancestry directly back to King David. And that creates a problem modern theology struggles to explain. Because if Mary herself descended from the house of David, and Ethiopia's royal line preserved the same ancestral bloodline for millennia, then Ethiopia's connection to Christ may not have been viewed merely as spiritual. It may have been viewed as familial, literal, biological. Then genetics entered the conversation. Modern DNA studies found ancient Levantine markers within Ethiopian populations dating back roughly 3,000 years, linking groups from the region of ancient Israel and Syria directly to Ethiopia. Not symbolic migration, real people, real bloodlines carried across history, and suddenly, traditions dismissed for centuries no longer sounded quite so impossible. As it turns out, those ancient traditions may not have survived only in stories. They may have been preserved inside human DNA itself. And that helps explain why Ethiopian Christianity developed so differently from the version most of the West knows today. The Saturday Sabbath remained intact. Circumcision on the 8th day continued. Dietary laws from Levitical tradition were still observed. Ethiopia did not revive ancient Jewish customs later on. It simply never abandoned them, which leads to the possibility Abba Tekle considered more explosive than anything else. What if Jesus survived the crucifixion? Some ancient writings quietly suggest exactly that. No dramatic declarations, no grand announcements, just fragments scattered across traditions that hint at a man who disappeared rather than died. And if he needed refuge, a place beyond Rome's reach, somewhere protected by people connected to him by blood and loyalty, where would he go? What safer destination could there be than a kingdom ruled by his own lineage? Deep in the Ethiopian highlands, oral histories still speak about a mysterious figure who arrived from the north long ago. A healer, a teacher, a man whose wisdom and presence felt unlike anything the people had encountered before. They never called him Jesus. They called him the righteous teacher. No outside historian has ever fully explained who that teacher was. But Abba Tekle, his eyes now closed as ancient gaze prayers moved quietly across his lips, believed he knew the answer. And for centuries, the Ethiopian church carried a saying that sounded less like poetry and more like a guarded truth. The West has the water. We have the well. Then Brother Johannes finally asks the question hanging over the room all night. Why now? Why break 60 years of silence tonight? Why reveal these teachings now, with the candle nearly burned out and death already standing at the door? Abba Tekle slowly opens his eyes. Because, according to the manuscript itself, this was the moment the teachings were meant for. The Mashafakidus describes the final age, using a phrase from Ge'ez that translates roughly as webs of illusion. A world overflowing with connection but empty of truth. A reality where people communicate without standing together, where they see without using their own eyes, where images move faster than truth itself, and imitation slowly replaces authentic human experience. Read that again, carefully. A world of endless screens, endless noise, endless artificial realities. A description written nearly 2,000 years ago that sounds disturbingly similar to the internet, social media, and even the earliest forms of artificial intelligence. Inside Ethiopian monastic tradition, there is a theory that changes everything. The monks were never simply preserving ancient scripture. They were protecting a timed release, an emergency message meant to remain hidden until humanity entered the exact conditions described in the text itself. The trigger was never a specific year. The trigger was recognition. And according to Abba Tekle, that moment is now. Faith in governments collapsing. Faith in media collapsing. Trust in organized religion declining faster than at any point in modern history. Millions of people searching desperately for something direct and real, something that does not require institutions, authorities, or gatekeepers standing between them and truth. Then comes the part that changes how the entire history of Christianity is viewed. According to the internal logic of these Ethiopian traditions, the Council of Nicaea did more than organize doctrine in 325 AD. It neutralized it. The books removed from the canon were not discarded simply because they were unreliable. They were dangerous because they described human beings as spiritually sovereign, capable of direct connection with the divine without priests, empires, or institutions controlling access. Remove those books, and you remove humanity's spiritual independence. Ethiopia refused to let those teachings disappear. And some passages inside the Mashafakadan go even further, sounding like religion entirely, and begin sounding strangely scientific. Researchers studying fragments of the text noticed descriptions resembling resonant frequency manipulation, the idea that sound and vibration can influence physical matter itself. Suddenly, the legends surrounding Lalibela sound different. What if the stories about angels carving churches through stone were describing technology rather than mythology? Replace angels with advanced acoustic engineering, and the impossible architecture begins to sound far less impossible. Maybe these teachings were never only spiritual. Maybe they were remnants of a buried science, a knowledge system intentionally hidden by people who understood exactly how powerful it was. And now, high above northern Ethiopia, the final guardian of that knowledge is running out of time. The candle is nearly gone. Brother Johannes hears the uneven rattle in the old monk's breathing. Deacon Michael's eyes fill with tears, though he is not a man known for emotion. Abba Tekle rests one trembling hand across the open pages of the Mashafa Kedan. The dark stains of ink still cover his fingertips after a lifetime spent preserving the manuscript. If one of those three teachings stayed with you, tell me in the comments which one affected you most. Was it the temple of the heart, the silence between thoughts, or the warning about darkness hiding behind a familiar face? And subscribe now, because Abba Tekle did not guard these teachings for 6 decades just for the people meant to hear them to scroll away. Because what we uncovered tonight is only the beginning.